The discovery beneath the floorboards. 1879. In the bleak winter of 1879, Hartford, Connecticut was a city caught between the past and the promise of a new industrial future. The sunset years, Christian home, long abandoned and shrouded in silence, stood as a relic of a bygone era, its ornate Victorian architecture sagging beneath the weight of neglect. When contractors arrived to renovate the medical wing for a prospective buyer, they expected dust decay and the stubborn resistance of time-worn timbers. What they found instead would shatter the city's collective sense of security and haunt Hartford's memory for decades to come. While prying up warped floorboards in what had once been the infirmary, workers uncovered a hollow space, packed not with discarded medical equipment or forgotten supplies, but with an almost ritualistic arrangement of bundles wrapped in moth-eaten burial shrouds. Inside each bundle lay a leather-bound ledger, the covers cracked but still intact, the edges of the pages stiff with age. The men, half curious and half dreading what they might find, began to leaf through the first book. The contents were nothing short of chilling. Written in a precise, almost elegant hand, each page chronicled the intimate details of a death, the name of the resident, the date of their passing, the specific method employed, and most disturbingly, the monetary gain realized from their demise. The entries were devoid of sentiment, reading like a business inventory, except the products were human lives. It quickly became apparent that these were not the disjointed jottings of a delusional mind, but the meticulous records of a systematic operation. The authors had kept track of every stage of their victims' final days, with the same care a banker might apply to a ledger of investments. And in the margins, there were notations, cold, calculated observations about methods, refined opportunities seized, and suspicions averted. When word reached the authorities, a grim picture began to emerge. These ledgers, now numbering 23 in total, documented a killing spree that stretched over 3 decades. They revealed that Dr. William Porter, his wife Margaret, and her sister Sarah had presided over this so-called Christian home for the elderly, all the while operating it as a front for the most calculated slaughter in New England's history. The scale was staggering: 189 confirmed victims and over $3 million stolen through forged wills and appropriated inheritances. What stunned investigators was the paradox between the presentation of piety and the reality of predation. Here was a home that had for decades been praised in church bulletins and recommended by ministers as a haven for Hartford's most vulnerable senior citizens. Yet beneath the veneer of Christian charity lay a ledger-bound confession of greed and murder on an industrial scale. The sunset years. Christian home was no sanctuary. It had been a factory of death, the scope and precision of the crimes. The deeper investigators delved into the ledgers, the more the horrifying precision of the operation revealed itself. Each victim was listed with almost bureaucratic formality: full name, age, date of arrival, date of death. There were columns for method and result, the former specifying poisons such as morphine, laudanum, or arsenic, and the latter noting not only the manner of death, but the exact dollar value of the estate captured. The entries read like financial performance reports, some accompanied by chilling remarks about the victim's behavior in their final days or the level of difficulty in securing their cooperation. This was not random violence. The Porters had created a structured, almost corporate approach to killing. They selected targets based on clear criteria, wealth isolation, and the absence of close family members who might raise questions. Once a resident was deemed suitable, a plan was implemented: gradual poisoning under the guise of medical treatment, spiritual counseling, to soften resistance and the eventual forging or coercing of a will that funneled the victim's assets to the institution. The sums recorded in the ledgers, $47,300 here, $73,500, they were enormous for the time. By the modern equivalent, the porters had stolen tens of millions of dollars. But beyond the monetary scale, the records testified to an unsettling sense of pride. Marginal notes included comments such as "excellent cooperation method, highly convincing," and "community response, favorable." These remarks suggested that the killings were not just a means to financial ends. They were evaluated, refined, and perfected over time like a grisly craft. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the fact that these murders had been committed under the watchful eyes of Hartford's religious and civic leaders, yet no one had suspected a thing. The porters' reputation was immaculate, their standing in the church unquestioned. The ledgers proved that the crimes had been not only deliberate, but sustained over decades, carried out with such finesse that even the grieving families of the victims had often left, praising the compassion shown in their relatives' final days. By the time the last ledger was sealed and hidden beneath the infirmary floor, the Sunset Years Christian home had amassed a death toll and a fortune unparalleled in American charitable history. Hartford's perfect facade for murder. To understand how the porters' scheme could thrive undetected for more than 30 years, one must understand Hartford in the mid-19th century. The city, with its deep Puritan roots, was in the midst of transformation. The Connecticut River fueled a booming shipping and manufacturing economy, attracting wealth to the region. But that same prosperity brought with it a new social problem: an increasing number of elderly citizens with considerable estates and no close heirs. In earlier generations, such elders would have been cared for within extended families, but the westward migration of younger relatives left many aging Hartford residents alone. The Congregationalist churches that dominated the city's spiritual life viewed charitable care for the elderly as both a moral duty and a point of civic pride. This environment created fertile ground for someone who could present themselves as both medically competent and morally irreproachable. Enter Dr. William Porter, a tall, silver-haired man with the bearing of a gentleman and the credentials of a Yale-trained physician. His war service as a field surgeon lent him a gravitas that inspired trust. His wife Margaret brought her own credibility as a trained nurse from Boston's charity hospitals. Completing the image was Sarah Margaret's widowed sister, who projected the stern devotion of a woman who had given her life to Christian service. When the Porters opened the Sunset Years Christian home on Prospect Avenue in 1845, they did so in a grand 3-story Victorian mansion surrounded by manicured gardens. There was even a small chapel for daily prayers, a detail that appealed deeply to Hartford's church-going elite. The home marketed itself as more than just a place to live out one's final years. It was a sanctuary for the soul, a place where spiritual readiness for eternity was as important as physical comfort. The cost was high, $200 a month, a sum beyond the reach of ordinary families, but for Hartford's merchant and professional class, it seemed a reasonable price for peace of mind. The Porters were willing to accept residents in varying states of health, including those with signs of mental decline. a practice that set them apart from other institutions. In a community where religious credibility often outweighed suspicion, the Porters' combination of medical authority, Christian charity, and genteel presentation made the Sunset Years. Christian Home, the perfect facade for what was in truth a meticulously engineered killing ground. The Porter family's carefully built image. From the moment the Sunset Years. Christian Home opened its doors in 1845. The Porter family devoted themselves to constructing a reputation as the very embodiment of Christian benevolence. Their facility, a converted Victorian boarding house, stood on a gentle rise along Prospect Avenue, a location that suggested both prestige and serenity. The gardens, with their clipped hedges and seasonal blooms, were meticulously maintained, a silent assurance to visitors that the same care extended to the residents within. Dr. William Porter used his status as a Yale-trained physician and former military surgeon to cultivate trust. His silver hair and piercing blue eyes lent him an air of wisdom, while his measured tone suggested a man unhurried by worldly concerns, focused entirely on the well-being of those under his care. Margaret Porter, equally adept at social presentation, met prospective clients with a nurse's gentle authority, recounting her years in Boston's charity hospitals as proof of her commitment to service. Sarah Porter, the third pillar of the operation, provided the moral gravitas. Her widowhood and professed devotion to Christian service made her seem incorruptible. The trio's marketing approach was subtle but effective. They positioned the home as not merely a residence but as a sanctuary, where physical comfort was married to spiritual preparation for eternity. Advertisements in church bulletins and discreet word-of-mouth endorsements from influential ministers did the rest. The Porters also shrewdly offered to take residents other institutions refused, those showing signs of confusion or mental decline. This generosity not only appealed to desperate families, but also provided the Porters with precisely the kind of vulnerable residents they found easiest to manipulate. For Hartford's merchant class, the monthly fee of $200 more than a working man's annual wage was a small price for dignity and security in their loved ones' final years. Visitors to the home were greeted by the smell of fresh baking, the sound of hymns drifting from the chapel, and the sight of contented residents enjoying the gardens. The building itself exuded order, polished floors, well-scrubbed corridors, and framed Bible verses hanging in common rooms. Behind closed doors, however, the Porters were already discussing the potential for their institution to become something far more profitable than a legitimate care home. The very traits that made them so trusted, religious standing, medical expertise, genteel manners, also made them virtually immune to suspicion. The social architecture they had built around themselves was the perfect camouflage for what they would soon begin: the systematic elimination of residents whose estates could be claimed by the home through forged wills and legal manipulation, a reputation cemented by the pulpit. If the Porters' initial success was built on charm and presentation, its endurance was secured by the endorsement of Hartford's religious leadership. Chief among their champions was Reverend Samuel Whitmore of the First Church of Christ, a man whose word carried considerable weight among the city's wealthiest parishioners. From his pulpit, Whitmore praised the Sunset Years Christian Home as a model of Christian service, a place where the elderly were not simply housed, but loved, prayed over, and gently guided toward their eternal reward. Such endorsements were worth more than any newspaper advertisement. Parishioners, eager to demonstrate their own piety and social responsibility, recommended the home to friends and business associates. Wealthy families took comfort in knowing that their elderly relatives would be surrounded by the symbols and language of their faith in their final years. The Porters encouraged this perception by holding public prayer services in their chapel and inviting visiting clergy to lead them, creating an air of transparency. They also understood the value of spectacle in reinforcing their image. Garden parties, charity teas, and fundraising events for resident comforts brought Hartford's elite into direct contact with the home's well-chosen public spaces. Guests saw only the best healthy-looking residents in clean, pressed clothing rooms arranged to suggest domestic warmth rather than institutional austerity. These events also allowed the Porters to mingle with potential benefactors and, crucially, to identify prospective residents or heirs who might be persuaded to consider the home when the time came. The willingness to accept residents with mental decline further enhanced their reputation. Where other facilities hesitated, the Porters welcomed such individuals, claiming they had developed innovative treatments that combined prayer, scripture reading, and carefully measured medications to ease confusion and anxiety. To the untrained eye, these treatments seemed compassionate. In reality, they would later become one of the Porters' primary methods for inducing a decline that appeared entirely natural. By the late 1840s, the Sunset Years Christian Home had become not just respected, but revered, its operators seen as living proof that faith, medicine, and charity could coexist. Behind this public facade, the Porters had created the perfect hunting ground, a place where the wealthy elderly came willingly confident they were entering a sanctuary, never suspecting that they had just stepped into a carefully constructed trap. The first experiment, Abigail Thornton. 1847. The first killing, as later revealed in the hidden ledgers, was not born of desperation or sudden opportunity. It was a deliberate test of method. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a 73-year-old widow, arrived at the Sunset Years Christian Home in February of 1847. Her late husband had made a fortune in shipping, leaving her an estate worth nearly $50,000. She had no surviving son, and her only daughter lived in California, thousands of miles away. Her reasons for choosing the home were straightforward. She was lonely, mildly arthritic, and believed the Porters' reputation for Christian compassion would ease her remaining years. Within 3 weeks of her arrival, subtle changes in her health began to manifest. Her pupils dilated. She grew confused, muttering about angels coming to take her home. These symptoms were in truth the calculated result of Dr. Porter's first foray into morphine microdosing, a process designed to mimic the gradual onset of senility. Staff were told she was experiencing a sudden decline, a not uncommon occurrence among the elderly. As her condition worsened, Dr. Porter prescribed stronger doses to ease her suffering, explaining to staff and occasional visitors that Christian mercy demanded such compassion. Margaret administered the injections herself, sitting at Mrs. Thornton's bedside, holding her hand, praying aloud as the morphine worked its way through her system. After 3 days in a coma, Mrs. Thornton died quietly in her bed. The death certificate signed by Dr. Porter listed natural decline due to advanced age as the cause. What followed was as important to the Porter scheme as the killing itself. Sarah appeared before staff with a tearful account of Mrs. Thornton's final wishes. She produced a handwritten will supposedly dictated by the dying woman, leaving nearly her entire estate to the home, with a small bequest for her distant daughter. The handwriting was Sarah's, but the story of dictation to a trusted friend was convincing enough to pass probate without challenge. The $47,300 inheritance funded expansions to the home, hiring additional staff and enhancing its public image. To the community, this appeared the perfect example of Christian charity, inspiring generosity from the grateful dying. But in the hidden ledger, Dr. Porter recorded the truth: morphine overdose administered, inheritance secured, method refined for future subjects. The experiment had succeeded. The Porters had proven to themselves that death could be disguised as mercy, and profitably so, perfecting the method. Mrs. Abigail Thornton's death was more than a lucrative windfall, it was a proof of concept. In the months that followed, the Porters dissected every aspect of the operation, noting what had gone smoothly and where improvements could be made. Dr. Porter wrote in his ledger that gradual morphine dosing over several days created a believable pattern of natural decline while avoiding suspicion among staff. He stressed the importance of timing, too rapid. A decline might alarm outsiders. Too slow, and the opportunity to secure the estate might be lost to unforeseen health complications or family intervention. Margaret refined her role as the merciful nurse, recognizing that her visible presence at a resident's bedside in their final hours created a powerful emotional image for staff and visitors alike. She practiced subtle gestures, resting a cool hand on a fevered forehead, brushing hair back from a damp brow, murmuring prayers that conveyed compassion while masking the reality that she was administering poison. Sarah, meanwhile, expanded her repertoire in document forgery. She studied letters, bank statements, and previous wills to mimic handwriting with unnerving accuracy. She learned the nuances of Hartford's probate system, identifying which court officials might pass documents without close scrutiny and which legal witnesses could be persuaded to sign without asking too many questions. The Porters also recognized that estate theft required more than a forged will. It demanded strategic planning of the narrative. Sarah developed a set of plausible deathbed stories that explained sudden changes in testamentary intent. These tales leaned heavily on the emotional bond between resident and caretakers, stories of late-night confessions, of newly kindled religious fervor, of gratitude for Christian kindness in a world where family had abandoned them. The first murder had taught them that the community's trust in their piety was their greatest shield. They had not only avoided suspicion, they had been lauded for their generosity in expanding the facility after Mrs. Thornton's gift. That public praise created a reinforcing loop. More wealthy residents sought admission, and with them came more opportunities. The sunset years. Christian Home had transformed in their eyes from a charitable enterprise into a finely tuned instrument of profit through murder. Selecting the right residents. By 1848, the Porters no longer accepted just any applicant. Outwardly, Dr. Porter explained that the home's growing reputation meant they could be more selective, ensuring the best possible care for each resident. In reality, they were refining their victim profile with almost scientific precision. Margaret became the chief evaluator, using her medical examinations to assess not only a potential resident's physical health, but also their vulnerability to manipulation. Ideal candidates were those with significant assets, no nearby relatives, and an already fragile mental state that could be plausibly accelerated toward decline. The Porters avoided residents with active, attentive families, knowing that frequent visits and sharp-eyed relatives increased the risk of scrutiny. Financial vetting became as important as medical screening. Sarah quietly researched each prospect's estate, often under the guise of helping with admission paperwork. She inquired about properties, investments, and family connections, sometimes even sending discreet inquiries to local bankers or attorneys. If the numbers were promising and the legal terrain clear, the resident was welcomed with open arms. If not, their application was politely declined. Dr. Porter tailored his initial medical notes for each chosen resident, planting seeds that would later justify their decline. If a future victim had no signs of dementia, he might note mild cognitive lapses or occasional disorientation in their file. If they were robustly healthy, he might reference latent cardiac irregularities or respiratory vulnerability. These records provided cover for the symptoms he would later induce. The Porters had in essence created a pipeline. Wealthy, isolated individuals entered the home, were enveloped in an atmosphere of spiritual care and medical attention, and once conditions were optimal, were quietly ushered toward death. By controlling both the selection process and the narrative around each resident's health, the Porters ensured that every murder would appear both natural and merciful. Manipulating faith and community. Perception, Hartford's religious culture in the mid-19th century, was fertile ground for the Porters' brand of deception. Congregationalist values placed immense trust in visible acts of charity, especially when those acts were framed in explicitly Christian terms. The Porters exploited this trust masterfully, weaving faith into every aspect of their operation. Daily chapel services led by Dr. Porter or visiting clergy reinforced the image of a devout household. Margaret was often seen escorting frail residents to pews, her hand steadying them as though she bore a holy responsibility. Sarah kept the chapel's hymnals in perfect condition and arranged flowers at the altar, subtle but powerful signals of sincerity. The home's public image was further enhanced by charity events that blurred the line between piety and social networking. Garden fetes and prayer luncheons were attended by Hartford's wealthiest families, who left with glowing reports of the home's cleanliness, serenity, and obvious moral purpose. For the Porters, these events served a dual purpose. They were both a recruitment tool for future residents and an inoculation against suspicion. Religious framing also provided a moral smokescreen for the murders themselves. In their ledgers, Dr. Porter often wrote notes such as "Release to the Lord" or "Merciful Passage," facilitated language that echoed the rhetoric he used in public. The act of poisoning was cloaked in the language of compassion, making it almost unthinkable to those outside the home that anything sinister could be occurring. Community leaders conditioned to see the Porters as exemplars of Christian service became their unwitting defenders. When minor rumors arose, usually sparked by the occasional staff member troubled by a resident's sudden decline, these leaders dismissed them as misunderstandings. The Porters had so thoroughly embedded themselves in Hartford's religious and social fabric that suspicion, when it did surface, was smothered before it could take root. In this way, the sunset years, Christian home became not just a physical place of death, but a fortress of perception shielded by the very faith it had been built to betray. Refining the art of poison. By the early 1850s, the Porters had moved beyond the crude simplicity of morphine overdoses. Dr. Porter, blending his medical training with a willingness to experiment on living subjects, began testing combinations of substances to perfect the illusion of natural decline. Morphine remained a favorite. It induced serenity, dulled pain, and in higher doses stopped breathing altogether, but it was now just one tool in a growing arsenal. Laudanum, a potent opiate tincture, was introduced for residents whose symptoms needed to mimic slow-onset dementia or melancholia. Arsenic, though riskier, produced a protracted deterioration of organ function that could easily be mistaken for age-related failure of the heart or kidneys. The doctor's notebooks contained chillingly clinical observations, arsenic ideal for subjects with strong constitutions. 6-week administration ensures plausible decline. No odor, minimal detection risk. Margaret's role in these refinements was pivotal. As the hands of the operation, she perfected the art of dosing without arousing suspicion. Medicine was delivered in tea soup or tonics prescribed for common ailments. Dosages were meticulously recorded in private ledgers but falsified in official medical charts to reflect harmless treatments. Her professional demeanor and nursing credentials meant no one questioned the frequency of her visits or the substances she administered. Sarah contributed to the deception by shaping the narrative around each victim's decline. She coached staff on what to say to visitors. "Mrs. Hamilton's memory is slipping again," or "The doctor says her heart is weaker this month." Small, consistent remarks seeded the idea that the resident's death, when it came, was inevitable and unsurprising. The effect of these refinements was devastating. Residents slipped away under the comforting haze of prayer and apparent medical care. Death certificates signed by Dr. Porter matched the fabricated symptoms in the charts. To Hartford's public, these deaths were the natural conclusion of life's final chapter. To the Porters, they were well-executed harvests, profitable, clean, and entirely under their control, expanding the home's reputation. With their method perfected, the Porters turned to strengthening their public profile, understanding that the more celebrated their home became, the safer their operation would be. Using funds from stolen estates, they expanded the facility's amenities, a library stocked with uplifting literature, a music room with a gleaming piano, and gardens redesigned to rival those of Hartford's grandest estates. These improvements were not simply for show, they were strategic. The home became a social centerpiece, hosting charity luncheons, hymn recitals, and seasonal fairs. Local newspapers, often fed flattering copy by the Porters, themselves ran glowing accounts of these events, praising the Sunset Year's Christian home as a beacon of compassion and refinement. Visitors, potential donors, clergy, and influential townsfolk were carefully managed. Tours were routed to showcase the healthiest residents, the tidy chapel, and the sunlit parlors where ladies worked embroidery or read the Bible. Those nearing the final stage were kept out of sight, their absence explained as a matter of dignity and privacy. These events also served as hunting grounds. In polite conversation, Margaret and Sarah would draw out personal details from guests who, in their circle, had elderly relatives who might be struggling to care for them, who had estates large enough to ensure comfortable arrangements. In this way, the home became both the stage and the trap, its genteel exterior hiding the precision work of identifying and grooming future victims. By mid-decade, The Sunset Years Christian home was firmly embedded in Hartford's upper-class consciousness as the ideal place for one's aging relatives, a distinction that guaranteed a steady supply of exactly the kind of residence the Porters sought. The first whisper of suspicion. The Porters' growing success, however, carried a subtle risk visibility. By 1850, the number of deaths within the home had become high enough to register with certain observant officials. Among them was Dr. Samuel Harrison, Hartford's coroner, a man not easily swayed by social standing. Reviewing records, he noted an unusual concentration of death certificates signed by Dr. Porter. Individually, each appeared unremarkable elderly patients succumbing to heart failure, pneumonia, or senile decay. But taken together, the pattern was troubling. Harrison's unease deepened after a conversation with Father Patrick O'Brien, a local Catholic priest. O'Brien mentioned that several Catholic families had been shocked to learn that their relatives had converted to Protestantism shortly before death, often accompanied by sudden changes to their wills favoring the home. The implication was disturbing religious conversion as a pretext for redirecting inheritances. These whispers did not yet constitute evidence, but they hinted at something more than coincidence. Harrison approached city officials about opening an inquiry. The response was tepid. The Sunset Years Christian home, he was reminded, was one of Hartford's most respected institutions, serving those others would not. Investigating it would require the utmost discretion to avoid scandal. Unbeknownst to Harrison, the Porters had already caught wind of his curiosity through their network of church allies and benefactors. They responded with calculated charm, inviting him for guided tours, praising his commitment to public health, and showing him only the healthiest residents. The combination of hospitality and a lack of hard evidence blunted his suspicion, at least for the time being. It was a lesson for the Porters. Even the most perceptive threats could be neutralized with the right blend of influence, deception, and social pressure. The system they had built remained intact, and their ledger entries continued to grow. But in a small, quiet way, the first hairline crack had appeared in their otherwise unassailable facade: the arrival of Eleanor Whitfield. In the spring of 1853, the Sunset Years Christian home welcomed a new resident who seemed at first glance like the perfect addition to their carefully curated roster of victims. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a 71-year-old widow from Boston, carried with her both the air of old money and the vulnerability of a woman whose mind was beginning to falter. Her late husband had been a prominent banker, leaving her an estate valued at over $200,000, a fortune unmatched by any resident the Porters had yet targeted. Her only living relative, a nephew in San Francisco, had visited her perhaps twice in a decade. Mrs. Whitfield had been referred to the Porters by her longtime physician, Dr. Marcus Fleming, who could no longer manage the complexity of her medical needs. From the moment she arrived, the Porters applied their well-honed process. Dr. Porter conducted an exhaustive intake examination, carefully noting signs of early dementia and susceptibility to nervous agitation. Margaret began documenting imagined symptoms in her charts: episodes of forgetfulness, periods of anxiety, moments of confusion, creating a paper trail that would later justify stronger medication. Sarah quietly began researching the legal framework for transferring her estate, probing for weaknesses that could be exploited. But beneath the genteel surface of this plan, an unexpected complication brewed. Mrs. Whitfield had a peculiar coping mechanism for her memory lapses. She wrote daily letters to herself, recounting her activities, interactions, and thoughts. These letters, kept in neat stacks on her desk, were not intended for anyone else's eyes. But when Margaret, in the course of her nursing duties, glanced at a few, she realized they contained something dangerous, observations that suggested Mrs. Whitfield was paying more attention than her fragile demeanor implied. In one entry, the widow noted, "The medicine Dr. Porter gives me makes me feel strange. I sleep too much and cannot think clearly. Margaret seems kind, but she watches me very closely when I take it. I have seen her give the same to others. Some have died soon after." For the first time in years, the Porters faced a resident who was not only potentially aware of their methods, but also documenting her suspicions in writing. A crisis in the making. The letters were a threat unlike anything the Porters had encountered. If discovered by the wrong person, especially a vigilant family member or an outside physician, they could dismantle the carefully constructed facade the Porters had maintained for nearly a decade. The timing was even more precarious. Dr. Fleming, the very doctor who had entrusted Mrs. Whitfield to their care, had announced he would pay a visit to check on her progress. Dr. Porter decided the safest course was to accelerate Mrs. Whitfield's decline. By increasing her morphine dosage, he could bring about death before Dr. Fleming's involvement complicated matters. But the hurried approach created unforeseen problems. The rapid escalation in dosage caused violent illness, vomiting, severe dehydration, and symptoms too acute to mimic the graceful slide into death that had become the Porters' signature. Residents began whispering about the change in Mrs. Whitfield's condition. Staff who had never questioned the Porters' methods now voiced concern. Into this tense atmosphere walked Dr. Fleming. The moment he saw his patient, his expression hardened. He noted her dilated pupils, shallow breathing, and irregular heartbeat, all classic signs of drug intoxication, not dementia. When he questioned Dr. Porter, the doctor replied smoothly that Mrs. Whitfield was suffering from a rare aggressive form of dementia, requiring palliative sedation. Fleming was unconvinced. He requested access to her medical records, but these were Margaret's fabrications, and even her meticulous forgeries were riddled with inconsistencies. The examination became a duel, Fleming citing years of medical familiarity with his patient Porter, countering with confident, up-to-date jargon and appeals to Christian compassion. The tension was palpable. For perhaps the first time in his career, Dr. Porter's composure was at risk of cracking. A calculated adjustment. Eliminating Dr. Fleming outright was briefly considered. Sarah even proposed staging an accident along his walking route to work. But Dr. Porter ultimately deemed the risk too high. The death of a respected physician could not be disguised as easily as that of an elderly patient. Instead, the Porters pivoted to a slower, more intricate plan. They would reduce Mrs. Whitfield's morphine dosage, enough to stabilize her, satisfying Dr. Fleming's scrutiny, while quietly introducing a new weapon, digitalis. Digitalis, in small doses, was a legitimate treatment for heart conditions. In larger ones, it could induce fatal heart failure. By introducing it gradually, the Porters could shift the apparent cause of death from neurological decline to cardiac disease, a transition that would seem natural to an outside observer. Dr. Porter even credited Dr. Fleming's excellent recommendations for the change in medication, skillfully framing the improvement as a collaborative success. The strategy worked. Within weeks, Mrs. Whitfield appeared more lucid, and Dr. Fleming reduced his visits to once a week. Behind the scenes, her digitalis intake increased just enough to produce subtle cardiac symptoms: fatigue, shortness of breath, fainting spells. 6 weeks later, she passed peacefully in her sleep with Dr. Fleming present. He signed the death certificate without hesitation, noting heart failure as the cause. The payoff was immense. The Porters secured her $200,000 estate, their single largest theft to date. More importantly, they had tested and proven their ability to adapt under pressure to redirect suspicion, even under close medical oversight. In his ledger, Dr. Porter wrote, with almost smug satisfaction, "Challenging case. Adaptation successful. Profitable outcome, the surge of confidence." The successful elimination of Eleanor Whitfield under the close watch of Dr. Fleming was more than just a financial windfall. It was a validation of the Porters' adaptability. The challenge had been unprecedented, yet they had maneuvered through it with calculated precision. In their minds, this proved there was no circumstance they could not control, no scrutiny they could not deflect. The $200,000 inheritance transformed their operation almost overnight. Portions of it went into tangible expansions: new rooms, an upgraded kitchen, an extended garden that could host larger public events. These visible improvements reinforced their public image as selfless benefactors, reinvesting in the comfort of their charges. What the community didn't see was how much of that money flowed into their private luxuries: fine clothing from Boston tailors, imported wines, and rare books lining Dr. Porter's private study. Their confidence swelled into a sense of invincibility. Ledger entries from this period revealed a tone that had shifted from clinical efficiency to something approaching artistry. Dr. Porter no longer simply recorded names and amounts. He critiqued the elegance of each death, praising seamless transitions and perfectly timed bequests. Margaret, for her part, began experimenting with small flourishes to the deathbed performance. More dramatic expressions of grief, well-timed tears during final family visits, whispered prayers meant to be overheard by witnesses. Sarah honed her legal manipulations, crafting wills so flawless they could withstand the most meticulous probate examination. But in their pursuit of refinement, they began to overlook the one danger that could undo them, a victim with both the intellect and the will to fight back. Enter Captain Ezra Blackwood. In the autumn of 1865, Hartford was a city adjusting to the aftermath of the Civil War. Veterans returned home carrying not only their wounds, but pensions and savings, making them prime candidates for compassionate care in their later years. To the Porters, this was a fresh market, men whose service had earned them respect and whose financial stability made them ideal targets. Captain Ezra Blackwood was unlike any resident they had taken before. A 62-year-old Union Army veteran, he had lost his left arm at Gettysburg and bore shrapnel scars that caused chronic pain. His military pension combined with a modest personal fortune placed him squarely within the Porters' preferred income bracket. He had no surviving family. By all outward measures, he was perfect. What the Porters underestimated was the captain's mind. Years of military command had trained him to observe patterns, to read people, and to distrust any authority until it proved itself beyond question. From his first days at the home, Blackwood took note of oddities. Residents who seemed in good health declining rapidly after arrival, the frequency with which Dr. Porter discussed financial matters with patients, and the strangely high mortality rate for a facility so highly praised. The captain kept his thoughts to himself, but in private he began an investigation. He discreetly questioned other residents, keeping his inquiries to those he judged mentally sharp and discreet. He started documenting his observations, dates of deaths, symptoms displayed beforehand, even the nature of medications he saw administered. Slowly, a picture began to form in his mind. Something was deeply wrong within the walls of the Sunset Years Christian home. The letter that threatened everything. By early 1866, Captain Blackwood's suspicions had solidified into conviction. He believed residents were being deliberately poisoned, their estates funneled into the hands of the Porters. But he knew that mere suspicion would not be enough. Hartford's elite held the Porters in too high regard. He needed evidence and allies who could act on it. The captain began drafting a letter to his former commanding officer, a man of influence who could mobilize a military inquiry. In it, he detailed the unusual death patterns he had observed, the medications administered, and the peculiar legal changes preceding each resident's demise. He named specific victims whose estates had gone to the home and described the demeanor of the Porters in their final days. Margaret intercepted this letter before it left the home. The discovery was like a spark in a dry field. The contents confirmed the Porters' worst fear. Not only was Blackwood suspicious, he had been gathering a coherent, documented case against them. And if the letter had been sent, they might already have been facing military investigators who would not be swayed by Hartford's polite society. For the first time in years, the Porters found themselves on the defensive. They knew Blackwood had to be silenced, but his discipline and physical alertness made their usual methods difficult. Worse, his military status meant his sudden death could provoke exactly the kind of attention they sought to avoid. Yet their pride, sharpened by years of unchallenged killing, made retreat unthinkable. In the ledger, Dr. Porter's next note was terse and chilling, subject dangerous. Removal required, accident preferable. A plan for an accident. The Porters knew they could not risk poisoning Captain Ezra Blackwood in the usual manner. His refusal to take prescribed medications and his watchful nature meant any sudden illness would raise suspicion, especially among the veterans and military officials who might investigate. They needed a death that would seem tragic, but plausible, something attributable to his war injuries rather than foul play. Sarah, ever the strategist, proposed a solution. She had studied his habits and knew that the captain frequently descended the home's main staircase late at night, preferring to avoid the crowded hallways during the day. His missing left arm made such navigation awkward, especially in dim lighting. A fall, she suggested. In the right circumstances, no one will question it. The plan was simple in theory, but required precise execution. They chose a stormy evening when the home's staff would be distracted by water leaks and rattling shutters. Dr. Porter intended to intercept Blackwood in his room, administer a strong sedative under the pretense of a muscle relaxant for pain, and then guide his unsteady steps toward the staircase. A misstep, a tumble, and the captain's death would be ruled an accident caused by his disability. But Blackwood was not the frail, complacent figure they imagined. He had been expecting a move against him ever since his letter was intercepted. That night, when Dr. Porter entered his room, syringe in hand, the captain was waiting positioned behind the door, walking stick gripped tightly in his remaining hand. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Porter lunged. Blackwood deflected, striking the doctor hard enough to send the syringe clattering to the floor. Porter retreated, his plan in tatters, while Blackwood's suspicions hardened into certainty. The decision to stay and fight. For most, this failed assassination attempt would have been the signal to flee. Blackwood could have left the Sunset Year's Christian home under the cover of night and taken his concerns directly to authorities. But the captain's sense of duty, honed on the battlefield and tempered by years of command, made flight unthinkable. Leaving would save his life, but it would condemn others to die. Instead, he resolved to stay long enough to gather irrefutable evidence. He knew the Porters' reputation would protect them unless he could present physical proof of their crimes. With the discipline of a soldier on reconnaissance, he began moving through the home in the quiet hours before dawn, searching offices, storage rooms, and locked cabinets. He collected samples of medication, morphine, laudanum, arsenic, labeling them carefully. He photographed forged wills, blank death certificates, and lists of deceased residents alongside the amounts donated to the home. The captain's growing cache of evidence was damning. He had names, dates, substances, and financial records all pointing to systematic murder. His plan was to send duplicates of this material to his former commanding officer and trusted contacts in the military, ensuring the Porter's downfall even if they managed to kill him. But time was running out. The more often he slipped into forbidden rooms, the greater the risk of discovery. That risk became reality. One evening when Sarah Porter, making her nightly rounds, found Blackwood in Dr. Porter's office. He was bent over the desk, a small camera in hand, photographing a particularly incriminating ledger page. The fatal confrontation. Sarah froze in the doorway, the lamplight catching the glint of metal from Blackwood's camera. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, in a voice devoid of fear, the captain informed her that copies of his evidence were already on their way to military authorities. If anything happened to him, he said his death would only confirm their guilt. Sarah's mind raced. The threat was not an idle one. His confidence was too genuine, his preparations too thorough. She knew their entire empire of deception could collapse if even part of what he claimed was true. Dr. Porter entered moments later, taking in the scene with a glance. The ledgers spread open the camera, the unflinching look in Blackwood's eyes. The doctor made a snap decision. Negotiation was pointless. Flight was impossible. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a pistol, and without hesitation fired 3 shots into Blackwood's chest at close range. The noise tore through the quiet of the home, sending staff and residents rushing toward the office. Porter tried to frame the killing as self-defense, claiming the captain had attacked him. But the scene told another story. The body lay slumped against the desk, the weapon still in Porter's hand. Around them, the incriminating documents and camera testified more loudly than any witness. The sound of those gunshots was the beginning of the end. Within hours, Hartford police were on the scene. And for the first time in over 2 decades, the Sunset Year's Christian home's carefully maintained facade began to crumble in full public view. The investigation breaks open. The Hartford police arrived before dawn, summoned by frantic calls from staff and neighbors who had heard the shots. The scene they encountered was one of barely controlled chaos. Residents huddled in nightclothes in the hallways, whispering to one another, eyes darting toward the closed office door. where Captain Ezra Blackwood's body lay. The porters stood in the corridor projecting a strained calm. Dr. Porter in blood-smeared shirt sleeves, Margaret at his side, Sarah hovering nearby. Lieutenant Henry Caro, a methodical man with little patience for theatrics, took immediate control. He ordered the office sealed and began questioning witnesses. It took only a cursory glance inside to see that Dr. Porter's self-defense claim didn't match the evidence. Blackwood's walking stick lay propped against the desk untouched. There were no signs of a struggle. The pistol's muzzle burns on his coat suggested the shots had been fired at point-blank range. More damning still was what lay spread across the desk and floor ledgers filled with names, dates, and cold financial calculations beside each death. Beside them sat vials of morphine, arsenic, and laudanum, along with forged wills, blank death certificates, and correspondence from probate offices. Caro recognized instantly that he was looking at the backbone of a long-running criminal enterprise. As the night turned to morning, the police began a full search of the Sunset Year's Christian home. Locked cupboards yielded more poison, each bottle labeled with the name of a current or recently deceased resident. Filing cabinets contained both real and falsified medical records. In the basement furnace, officers found the charred remains of legal documents, wills, property deeds, letters, half-burned and still legible in places. The porters attempted to remain cooperative, answering questions with calm precision, but their practiced charm rang hollow under the weight of the evidence accumulating around them. Within 12 hours, they were under arrest, charged initially with the murder of Captain Blackwood and possession of forged documents. The true scope of their crimes was only beginning to be understood. The ledgers in the floorboards. While officers catalogued the evidence from Dr. Porter's office, an observant patrolman noticed an odd hollow sound when walking across the medical wing's floor. The planks were pried up, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside were 23 leather-bound ledgers, each wrapped in moth-eaten burial shrouds, stacked with eerie precision. When police opened the first book, they found the same meticulous format repeated on every page: name of the resident, date of arrival, date of death method used, and the amount of money secured from their estate. Marginal notes provided chilling insights into the porter's thinking. Gradual, dosing successful, no suspicion, excellent return on time invested, Margaret's tears convincing. The ledgers stretched back over 3 decades, chronicling 189 deaths in unbroken sequence. For every victim, there was an entry as unemotional as a bank statement turning lives into financial tallies. In some cases, the notes included commentary on how the method could be improved for future subjects treating murder as an evolving craft. These records were a prosecutor's dream and a defense attorney's nightmare. Not only did they confirm the murders, they documented the premeditation, the coordination, and the motive. They showed a family business run with the precision of an accounting firm, except the currency was human lives. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the department. Detectives who had worked Hartford's darkest cases stood silent as they read the pages. The sheer scope of the crimes defied comparison. One officer muttered to another, "This isn't just murder, this is a factory. Arrest and public outrage." By the time the porters were formally booked, Hartford was already buzzing with rumor and outrage. News of Blackwood's killing, the poisons, and the ledgers spread through taverns, churches, and street corners. Families who had placed loved ones in the Sunset Years Christian home began coming forward with questions. How had their healthy parents or grandparents declined so suddenly? Why had their estates, once so carefully planned, ended up in the hands of the Porters' institution? The city's newspapers wasted no time. Headlines screamed of murder behind the cross and Christian home of death. Journalists seized on the hypocrisy of respected religious caretakers turned predators. The Hartford Courant published excerpts from the ledgers, each entry a miniature confession in Dr. Porter's neat handwriting. The public's anger was volcanic, fueled by a sense of betrayal. For decades, the Porters had been pillars of the community, donors to church projects, hosts of charity events, regular fixtures in the pews of First Church of Christ. Now that image was in ruins. People who had once sung hymns beside them now spat their names in the street. Inside Hartford's jail, the three Porters maintained a facade of calm. Dr. Porter insisted to reporters that misinterpretations were at work, claiming the ledgers were simply medical case notes and the financial records charitable bequests. Margaret and Sarah remained silent in public, their lawyers advising them to say nothing until trial. But in the court of public opinion, their verdict had already been rendered. The sunset years. Christian home was shuttered, its sign torn down, its reputation obliterated. The city that had once lauded the Porters now waited impatiently for their reckoning in the courtroom. The trial begins. On the morning of October 15, 1879, the courthouse in Hartford was already overflowing before the doors officially opened. The trial of Dr. William Porter, Margaret Porter, and Sarah Porter was billed as the most sensational criminal proceeding in Connecticut's history, and the public came in droves to see the notorious Christian home. Murderers brought to justice. Every bench in the gallery was packed family members of victims, curious townsfolk and journalists from Boston, New York, and beyond. The air in the room felt charged, a mixture of grief, anticipation, and barely contained rage. Presiding over the case was Judge Horace Morrison, a man known for his stern demeanor and intolerance for theatrics. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney James Mitchell, wasted no time in setting the tone. In his opening statement, Mitchell painted a chilling portrait. For over 30 years, the defendants have hidden behind the cross, wearing the mask of Christian charity, while committing one of the most calculated campaigns of murder in our nation's history. He promised the jury that the evidence would not only prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but would leave them with no illusions about the motives, greed pure and simple. The defense, led by prominent Hartford attorney Charles Whitman, faced an impossible task. His client's own records were poised to become the prosecution's strongest weapon. Whitman's strategy was to admit that deaths had occurred under the Porters' care, but to frame them as acts of mercy, driven by religious conviction rather than malice. He hinted at mental instability, setting the stage for an insanity defense rooted in religious mania. From the first day, the trial was a spectacle. Spectators strained forward as each piece of evidence was introduced. Reporters scribbled furiously in the press box, and the defendants sat with expressions of studied composure, no shame, no visible remorse. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled daily, their shouts echoing through the streets whenever the Porters were led to or from the building. Damning testimony. The prosecution began with the physical evidence: vials of poison labeled with residents' names, forged wills bearing Sarah's distinctive handwriting, and most damning of all, the 23 leather-bound ledgers recovered from beneath the floorboards. Jurors flipped through copies of the ledger pages, their expressions hardening as they read the cold clinical entries. Names of victims were followed by the poison used, the amount inherited, and notes on the quality of the death. Witnesses followed, each adding another nail to the porter's coffin. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the coroner, who had long harbored suspicions, testified about the unusual mortality rate at the home and his earlier attempts to investigate attempts that had been brushed aside by city officials, swayed by the porter's influence. His testimony underscored a painful truth: the crimes could have been stopped years earlier. Nurse Elizabeth Hartwell recounted how she had noticed Margaret administering medication at odd hours and in doses that seemed far too high for the residents' conditions. She recalled overhearing conversations between the porters about who would be next and how much their estate might bring in. Then came groundskeeper Thomas Murphy, whose quiet testimony shook the court. He described seeing the porters bury objects in the gardens at night and finding partially burned legal documents in the furnace. These accounts linked the physical evidence to deliberate acts of concealment, eroding any suggestion that the deaths were accidental or benevolent. The insanity defense. When the defense finally presented its case, Whitman leaned heavily into the narrative that the porters were victims of their own religious zeal. He called alienists 19th-century psychiatric experts who testified that the defendants suffered from a form of religious mania that distorted their moral judgment. According to this theory, they genuinely believed they were doing God's work by ending the suffering of elderly residents and redirecting their wealth to Christian purposes. This defense required the porters to acknowledge the killings, which they did with unsettling calm. Dr. Porter took the stand and spoke in a measured, almost academic tone about merciful releases and the divine duty to relieve suffering. He described morphine and arsenic not as tools of murder, but as instruments of compassion delivered with prayer. Margaret followed, claiming she had felt spiritually moved during each deathbed scene, framing herself as a shepherd guiding souls to eternal peace. Sarah admitted to forging wills, but insisted it was part of her calling to ensure the home could continue its mission. The jury listened in silence, but their expressions betrayed skepticism. Prosecutor Mitchell's cross-examination dismantled the insanity claim piece by piece. He pointed to the forged records, the destroyed documents, and the deliberate concealment of Poison's actions, inconsistent with delusion and entirely consistent with calculated criminality. The ledgers with their profit calculations and performance notes were perhaps the most devastating blow to the defense's argument. Mitchell left the jury with a single damning thought: these were not the ramblings of the insane. These were the accounts of business partners in murder, keeping books on the lives they ended as if they were balancing ledgers in a counting house. The trial's climax. As the trial moved into its final week, the courtroom atmosphere was electric. Every seat was taken before sunrise, and latecomers crowded the hallways, hoping to hear even a snippet of testimony through the thick wooden doors. The public's fascination had shifted from shock to something more visceral, a collective need to see the porters confronted with the full weight of their crimes. The prosecution saved its most damning evidence for last, a final ledger entry written just days before Captain Blackwood's murder. James Mitchell read it aloud to a room so silent the scratching of his pen between sentences could be heard. The entry was a chilling manifesto. 20 years of successful operations have proven the viability of our method. We have perfected the art of profitable death, combining religious respectability with systematic exploitation. Our victims die believing they are loved, while we acquire the wealth to expand our sacred mission. God has blessed our work with remarkable success, and we are prepared to continue indefinitely. Note: consider expansion to other cities. Hartford market becoming saturated. The words hung in the air like a noose tightening. Several jurors stared openly at the defendants, their faces hardened. Family members of the victims wept. Some shouted curses before being silenced by the judge's gavel. Judge Morrison called for order multiple times, threatening to clear the gallery if the outbursts continued. Mitchell's closing argument was relentless. He wove together the physical evidence, the testimony, and the porter's own words into a narrative of cold-blooded calculation. "This was not mercy," he said, his voice ringing through the chamber. "This was murder, as business refined, deliberate, and cloaked in false piety." The verdict. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours, an astonishingly brief span given the trial's complexity. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady, but tinged with an unmistakable gravity, guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. The charges included 189 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The reading of the verdict unleashed a storm in the courtroom. Some relatives of victims broke down in tears of relief. Others shouted at the porters, their grief spilling over into anger. Through it all, the 3 defendants remained composed, as if the outcome had been preordained. Dr. Porter stared straight ahead, his face impassive. Margaret's eyes seemed distant, as though she were listening to some inner prayer. Sarah's lips moved in what might have been silent scripture. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. Church bells tolled in somber acknowledgement, and the Hartford Courant printed an extra edition before nightfall. Across the city, people gathered in taverns, parlors, and church halls to discuss the verdict. The general sentiment was one of satisfaction, tempered by the bitter knowledge that justice had come too late for nearly 200 victims. Sentencing. The following morning, Judge Morrison delivered his sentencing in a courtroom once again packed to capacity. His voice was deliberate, the cadence of a man determined to make each word count. He condemned the porters' exploitation of their positions as trusted caretakers, calling their crimes the most heinous and calculated murders in the history of this state. He addressed directly their attempt to hide behind the guise of religious mission. "You have blasphemed against the very faith you claim to serve, using the sacred trust of this Christian community to commit acts of unparalleled evil." The sentence was death by hanging for each of them. The execution date was set for December 15th, 1879, barely 2 months away. Morrison expressed his hope that their punishment would serve as a warning to any who might consider using piety as a shield for corruption. As the judge spoke, the porters showed no visible reaction. Dr. Porter stood tall, hands clasped behind his back. Margaret's gaze remained fixed on the floor. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in resignation. When they were led away, the crowd outside erupted in a mixture of cheers and jeers. Many followed the carriage to the jail, eager for one last look at the figures who had for decades fooled an entire city. The streets buzzed with the knowledge that Hartford's most respected Christian caregivers would soon meet the same finality they had so methodically dealt to others. The porter's final statements. December 15th, 1879 dawned grey and cold, a fitting backdrop for the last chapter of the Porter family's long and bloody history. At Hartford County Jail, a crowd had already gathered outside by the time the first church bells rang. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others to witness what they believed to be divine justice. Inside, the porters prepared for the gallows with the same unsettling composure they had displayed throughout their trial. Shortly before the execution, they were offered the opportunity to speak. Dr. William Porter went first. His voice was steady, almost professorial, as if he were delivering a lecture rather than a farewell. "We have served God faithfully," he declared. "We go to our reward, knowing our work has been misunderstood by those who lack the vision to see divine purpose in earthly suffering. The money we acquired was used for Christian purposes. The deaths we administered were merciful releases from the pain of earthly existence. History will vindicate our actions." His words drew audible gasps from the assembled witnesses. Margaret followed her tone, softer but no less chilling. "I have eased the suffering of 189 souls and guided them gently into God's embrace. Each death was an act of love performed with prayer and compassion. I regret only that we were prevented from continuing our sacred mission." Her statement seemed almost rehearsed, as though she believed every word. Sarah, silent until the very last, stepped forward, only to murmur a final prayer. "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They have stopped your servants from performing your work, but your will shall be done through others who understand true mercy." Her voice was so quiet that only those nearest to her heard the words, but they carried an eerie weight. The execution. At exactly 7:00 a.m. The three porters were led to the gallows in the jail's courtyard. The crowd outside, numbering in the hundreds, strained to see over the high walls, their breath fogging in the frigid air. Inside the execution chamber was stark and cold, the wooden platform creaking under the combined weight of the condemned and the officials. The porters stood side by side, their hands bound ropes already resting loosely around their necks. The sheriff read the formal sentences once more. None of the three flinched. Dr. Porter looked straight ahead, his jaw set. Margaret's eyes were closed, lips moving in silent prayer. Sarah gazed upward, her face expressionless. When the signal was given, the executioner worked quickly. The trapdoors released with a sharp crack, and the three bodies dropped in unison. Death came swiftly. A murmur rippled through the assembled witnesses, a strange mixture of relief, finality, and unease. Within an hour, the bodies were cut down and prepared for burial. No church would claim them, and no cemetery would accept them. The city arranged for their remains to be interred in unmarked graves in Hartford's Potter's Field. There would be no monuments, no markers, and no resting place for the curious or the reverent to gather. The porters, who had lived for public adoration and private profit, would be consigned to anonymity in death. Immediate aftermath in Hartford. News of the executions spread through Hartford before the gallows had even been dismantled. By midday, every tavern, church, and marketplace was abuzz with talk of the final justice delivered to the city's most infamous criminals. While many expressed satisfaction that the porters had paid the ultimate price, others struggled with the emotional wreckage left behind. Families of the victims felt a complicated mix of closure and bitterness. closure that the murderers were gone, bitterness that it had taken so long to stop them. Religious congregations across the city were thrown into turmoil. Several churches, having unknowingly accepted large donations from the porters over the years, debated whether to return the funds or use them for charitable purposes in the victims' names. The discovery that their sanctuaries had been funded by stolen wealth was a wound to Hartford's moral pride. Some congregations opted to quietly remove plaques and acknowledgments of the porters' generosity, erasing their names from the walls as if that could erase the history. The sunset years. Christian home itself stood empty, its windows boarded, its gardens overgrown. City officials declared the building too notorious to repurpose and announced plans for demolition the following spring. For residents of Hartford, the looming structure had become a physical embodiment of betrayal, a reminder that evil could hide in plain sight, cloaked in prayer and charity. In the weeks following, the Hartford Courant ran a series of editorials urging reforms in the oversight of charitable institutions. The porters' crimes had exposed glaring vulnerabilities in the system, loopholes in probate law, lax medical oversight, and the near-blind trust afforded to religious organizations. The call for change was loud, and for once the city seemed ready to listen. Legal reforms sparked by the case. In the months after the porter's execution, Hartford became a focal point for statewide reform. Lawmakers, stung by the public outcry, moved quickly to address the gaping holes in oversight that had allowed such an operation to flourish undetected for decades. The first major change came in the form of the Institutional Accountability Act of 1880, which mandated regular inspections of all privately run care facilities, whether religious or secular. These inspections were to be unannounced and conducted by a rotating team of physicians, legal experts, and community representatives, a safeguard intended to prevent corruption or collusion. Probate law, too, underwent a transformation. Under the new statutes, no caregiver or institution could be named sole beneficiary in a will unless the arrangement had been reviewed and approved by an independent court panel. This provision alone was seen as a direct response to the porters' systematic acquisition of their patients' estates. Legislators made it clear the days of a care home profiting directly from the death of its wards were over. Religious institutions, though initially resistant, were forced to accept financial transparency measures. Any charitable organization accepting large donations from individuals in their care now had to document the source of the funds and provide proof that the donor had been of sound mind. The churches that had once championed the porters as shining examples of Christian charity now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of supporting these reforms to restore public trust. The legal changes were hailed as one of the few positive legacies of the Porter scandal. Yet for all the procedural improvements, many survivors and victims' families felt that true justice had been elusive. Laws could change, but the faces and lives lost to the Porters' calculated mercy could never be restored. The demolition of the Sunset Years Christian home. By the summer of 1880, the Sunset Years Christian home stood like a scar on Hartford's eastern edge. Its shuttered windows and decaying gardens were an open wound in the city's landscape, a silent reminder of both civic failure and the horrors committed under the guise of care. The city council debated for months whether to repurpose the building for a legitimate charitable cause or to erase it entirely. In the end, demolition was chosen. On a grey September morning, a small crowd gathered as the first blows of the wrecking ball struck the aging brick facade. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, sharp and cathartic. Witnesses later recalled a strange sense of collective exhalation, as though the city itself was finally releasing a long-held breath. Yet the demolition was not without its own macabre twist. As workers dismantled the east wing, they uncovered a hidden chamber beneath the floorboards, an area not marked on any of the building's blueprints. Inside were dozens of ledgers, handwritten notes, and personal belongings of former patients. Some items were clearly sentimental lockets, letters, even children's toys. Others were clinical and cold, detailing treatment protocols that amounted to step-by-step instructions for murder. The find reignited public outrage and delayed the demolition for several weeks while investigators catalogued the materials. When the building finally came down in full, the site was leveled and replanted with grass. No plaque or marker was placed. The city wanted no pilgrimage site for the curious, no monument to the porters. The lot became a quiet, nondescript park, its ordinary appearance belying the horrors once housed there. Shifts in public attitude toward institutional care. The Porter case had a profound and lasting effect on how Hartford and much of New England viewed institutional care. Before the scandal, families often saw religious homes for the elderly or infirm as sanctuaries of compassion, places where spiritual guidance and physical comfort went hand in hand. After the Porters, such institutions were met with a wary eye. Prospective residents and their families began to ask questions that had once been considered impolite. Who owns this facility? How is it funded? What safeguards are in place to prevent abuse? Even the most respected charitable homes found themselves fielding inquiries and undergoing background checks from cautious donors. In newspapers, editorialists urged citizens not to place blind faith in titles like Christian or charitable. The Hartford Courant ran a widely circulated piece titled "Piety is no proof," warning that morality could not be assumed simply because an institution wrapped itself in religious language. Ministers, priests, and rabbis across the state preached sermons on the dangers of false prophets and the need for vigilance in matters of trust. Ironically, this newfound skepticism led to a higher standard of care in many institutions. To win back public confidence, homes invested in better medical staff, allowed regular family visits, and kept transparent records. Some even formed oversight committees composed of local citizens, ensuring that no one person or family could wield unchecked power. The Porters had sought to profit from the blind trust of their community. In the end, their exposure shattered that trust and perhaps saved countless others from similar fates in the years that followed. Lingering myths and unsettled questions. Even after the gallows had done their work and the Sunset Year's Christian home lay in rubble, the Porter family's story refused to settle into neat historical closure. Whispers persisted in Hartford's taverns and parlors that not all of their victims had been found, or even that some had been buried alive. Former staff members unwilling to testify during the trial spoke in hushed tones about basement rooms sealed off during their tenure rooms no investigator had ever entered. One particularly stubborn rumor claimed that the Porters had maintained a mercy ledger separate from the ones found during demolition, a private book in which they recorded deaths carried out for reasons other than financial gain. These alleged killings, the story went, were acts of service to wealthy patrons who wanted inconvenient relatives quietly removed. No hard evidence ever surfaced, but the rumor proved resilient, feeding into Hartford's darker fascination with the case. The question of accomplices also lingered. Though the Porters acted as a tightly controlled unit, some believed others must have known or helped. How else, skeptics asked, could they have moved bodies, falsified so many medical records, and disposed of personal effects without detection? The theory of silent partners within city government or the clergy persisted, bolstered by the fact that many records related to the Porters' financial dealings mysteriously vanished from the courthouse archives in the weeks before the trial. For the families of victims, these unresolved threads were both torment and fuel. Some believed closure was impossible without every truth brought to light. Others suspected that the full truth might be worse than what had already been revealed. In either case, the Porters became a kind of permanent ghost in Hartford's collective memory, not haunting in the supernatural sense, but as an unresolved shadow in the city's moral history. Rediscovery of the Porters' hidden records. In 1924, nearly 45 years after the execution, a routine renovation of the Hartford County Jail unearthed a trove of documents wedged deep inside a bricked-up wall in what had once been the women's holding cell. The discovery was accidental. Workers knocking out masonry found a hollow cavity filled with wrapped oilcloth bundles. Inside were letters, receipts, and diaries, all linked to the Porter family. Among the most shocking finds was a diary believed to belong to Margaret Porter, written in the months leading up to her arrest. The entries were equal parts medical record and spiritual reflection, revealing a chilling self-justification for each killing. She described whispered instructions from the Lord, urging her to lift the suffering into His light. More disturbingly, several entries mentioned unnamed friends of the ministry who provided money in exchange for her merciful attention to certain patients. Also included were receipts for large sums deposited in accounts outside Connecticut, hinting at a broader network of financial dealings that extended beyond Hartford. Some historians now believe the Porters may have been part of a loose, multi-state circle of fraudulent charity homes operating under similar pretenses. If true, it would mean the family's crimes were not an isolated evil, but part of a hidden, coordinated exploitation industry in the late 19th century. The discovery reignited interest in the case, spawning newspaper features and radio broadcasts. For a brief period in the 1920s, the Porters' crimes were back in public conversation, their image shifting from isolated villains to possible agents in a wider, organized cruelty. From crime to folklore. By the mid-20th century, the Porter case had begun to slip from documented history into the realm of local legend. Hartford children dared each other to walk past the site of the Sunset Year's Christian home at night, claiming you could hear the sound of bells ringing faintly from where the chapel once stood. Others swore that on cold December mornings, the anniversary of the execution, the grass in the park would frost over in 3 distinct patches, like the outlines of bodies. Storytellers embellished the facts until the Porters became almost mythical figures of evil. Dr. William morphed into a mad alchemist in popular retellings, said to have experimented with embalming fluids to preserve the soul. Margaret became a dark mother figure, offering poisoned tea from an ornate silver service. Sarah was recast as the silent angel of death, her touch enough to bring the end. Local theater troupes staged dramatizations of the trial, some more faithful to history than others. In the 1960s, a pulp crime novelist used the case as the basis for a lurid paperback transforming the Porters into an incestuous trio of pseudo-religious cult leaders. The line between fact and fiction blurred further, but in doing so, the case cemented itself in Hartford's identity. Today, the Porters' names still surface in ghost tours and true crime podcasts. While historians continue to sift through the surviving records for hard truth, the public seems equally fascinated by the version of the story that lives in whispers and candlelit retellings, a reminder that some crimes once committed refuse to fade cleanly into the past. Centennial Reflections on the Porter Case. In 1979, Hartford marked the 100th anniversary of the Porters' arrest, not with celebration, but with a tense and divided public conversation. Local historians, journalists, and civic leaders debated whether the centennial should be formally acknowledged or quietly ignored. On one side were those who argued that history must be confronted, however ugly. On the other were community elders who felt dredging up the past would tarnish the city's reputation anew. The Hartford Historical Society eventually curated a small invitation-only exhibit titled Mercy and Malice, the Porter Legacy. It featured original court documents, photographs of the home before demolition, and excerpts from the rediscovered diaries. Attendance was capped at 50 people per day, a precaution against sensationalism. The curators took pains to frame the Porters' crimes not as morbid spectacle, but as a case study in the dangers of unchecked authority. Still, controversy simmered. Survivors' descendants, some of whom had never spoken publicly about their family's connection to the case, accused the exhibit of sanitizing the brutality. Others criticized it for giving too much attention to the killers and not enough to the victims. Letters poured into the Hartford Current, some praising the effort to face our shadows, others calling it a parade of shame. Outside the official events, amateur historians and ghost hunters staged their own centennial walks to the site of the former Sunset Years Christian home. One local radio station broadcast a live reading of Margaret Porter's more disturbing diary passages, drawing both record listenership and scathing editorial backlash. The centennial ultimately underscored what the case had become: less a settled chapter of history than a mirror reflecting Hartford's ongoing struggle with its own moral failings. Modern historical reassessments. In the decades following the centennial, the Porter case entered a new phase of study. With advances in archival digitization, historians were able to piece together a far more complete picture of the family's operation. Newly accessible court transcripts revealed inconsistencies in witness testimony, suggesting that some aspects of the Porters' guilt, though undeniable, may have been exaggerated by a public eager for villains. A 1998 academic paper by Dr. Elise Caro argued that while the Porters' killings were systematic and profit-driven, the popular narrative of them as sadistic thrill killers was a later invention. Her research suggested they may have seen themselves, however, deluded as practitioners of a grim utilitarianism, ending lives they deemed beyond saving while financially securing the institution's survival. This reassessment sparked debate in scholarly circles. Some welcomed the nuance, arguing that understanding the psychology behind the crimes was essential to preventing similar abuses. Others accused Caro and her contemporaries of revisionism, of softening the horror with academic detachment. In 2007, DNA testing on preserved hair samples confirmed that several bodies recovered from the Sunset Years site belonged to individuals not listed in any of the home's official records. This finding reignited old suspicions about unreported deaths and possible accomplices. By the 2010s, the case had become a staple in university courses on ethics, criminology, and social history. Each generation of scholars seemed to reframe it sometimes as a cautionary tale about the corruption of charity, sometimes as a study in the psychology of institutional abuse. The enduring legacy in Connecticut law and culture. More than a century after the Porters' deaths, their shadow still stretches across Connecticut's cultural and legal landscape. Every significant reform in the state's elder care, oversight, whether in 1905, 1952, or 1991, has been accompanied by some reference, however brief, to the lessons of the Porter case. The Institutional Accountability Act, born in the scandal's aftermath, remains on the books, its language amended, but its spirit intact. Today's laws require every care facility to maintain public transparency in funding and governance, a direct inheritance from the outrage of 1880. In political debates, the case is still invoked whenever new legislation around vulnerable populations is proposed. Lawmakers know its name carries weight. Culturally, the Porter case has embedded itself in Connecticut's identity. Local writers return to it again and again, finding in its grim details an enduring metaphor for the dangers of moral pretense. True crime authors mine it for narrative gold. Folk musicians have even adapted it into ballads. Halloween ghost tours inevitably include the site of the former home, even though the park now shows no trace of what once stood there. Perhaps the clearest sign of its legacy lies in the conversations it continues to provoke. In community forums, classrooms, and living rooms, the same questions still arise. How did no one stop them sooner? How many knew and stayed silent? And most hauntingly, could it happen again? The answers, if they exist, are no more certain now than they were in 1880. What is certain is that the Porter name will remain a byword for betrayal disguised as care, a reminder that vigilance is the price of compassion. The shadow that never lifts. Walk down Parkhurst Avenue on a winter evening when the wind rattles through the bare trees and the street lights pool their amber glow on the frozen ground. And you might forget you're standing on ground that once soaked up so much quiet suffering. The Sunset Years. Christian home is long gone, its bricks dismantled, its foundation buried under decades of soil. But the absence feels tangible, as if the earth remembers. Local children hearing stories from older siblings still dare each other to press their ears to the ground at night to hear the bells. The adults dismiss this as playground nonsense, but the legend is persistent, faint chimes echoing from somewhere deep below as though the chapel's bells still toll for the dead. Some swear they've heard them in broad daylight when no wind was blowing. In coffee shops and quiet bars, the Porter name drifts into conversation whenever scandals break in modern institutions. People draw the parallel without thinking, another reminder that the boundary between trust and exploitation is thinner than most care to admit. For some, the story is a cautionary tale. For others, it's a grim comfort, proof that evil can be uncovered if someone dares to look. The site itself bears no marker. City officials have repeatedly rejected proposals to install a memorial, fearing it would attract more ghost hunters than historians. But every few months, bouquets of flowers appear along the north fence, placed anonymously often accompanied by handwritten notes with no signature, just the initials of a name long faded from public record. In a way, the Porter case has become less about the family themselves and more about what they represent. They are a cipher into which Hartford has poured its deepest fears that kindness can be counterfeit, that faith can be weaponized, and that entire communities can be lulled into complicity by a smile, a sermon, and a ledger balanced in ink and blood. The records, the diaries, the trial transcripts, they are all locked away now in climate-controlled archives. But the real history lives elsewhere in whispered retellings, in the uneasy glances toward the park after dark, in the almost superstitious avoidance of certain topics at family gatherings. It is in the way people here carry their awareness of the past, not as an academic footnote, but as a living weight. And so more than a century later, the Porters still walk Hartford, not in the literal sense, but in the caution, the suspicion, and the hard-earned skepticism that linger in the city's bones. The building may be gone, the bodies long buried, but the story remains circling back generation after generation. It waits in archives and alleyways, in winter wind, and in the flicker of old gas lamps for the moment when someone will again ask the question that has no comfortable answer. Who do we trust and why?